Arben, Dritan, and Luan were not just names whispered in Albania. They were the architects of fear that stretched across Europe. From quiet streets in Tirana to shadowed alleyways in Milan, their rise was unstoppable, their reach invisible, and their empire built on blood, loyalty, and silence. In the early 1990s, Albania was a country in chaos. The fall of communism left a vacuum of power that no one could immediately fill. Banks were empty, government offices abandoned, and factories closed overnight. Streets that once hummed with controlled order now echoed with uncertainty. Ordinary people found themselves without jobs, without protection, and without hope. Among them, young men in small towns and villages began to form groups. At first, these groups were nothing more than gatherings of friends seeking safety, a way to survive in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. Hunger, fear, and desperation drove their actions. They scavenged for food, protected their families, and learned to navigate a country with collapsing rules. What started as survival, however, quickly transformed into something more sinister. The early gangs moved quietly. They did not announce their presence or make threats. They watched, they learned. They waited for the perfect moment to act. Albania's broken infrastructure, coupled with weak policing, offered them opportunities that more established criminals could only dream of. They discovered that influence could be gained without loud confrontations, and power could be built in the shadows. These young men began to experiment with small crime smuggling goods across borders, stealing from abandoned properties, and collecting debts. Every action taught them a lesson in risk and reward, shaping the mentality that would eventually make them formidable players in Europe's underworld. Family ties played a crucial role from the beginning. Many of the first members were related, bound together by blood or shared history. These connections were not just sentimental. They were strategic. Loyalty within these clans was absolute. Betrayal meant permanent consequences. Outsiders who tried to join were tested through dangerous tasks and risky errands, proving themselves under extreme pressure. Only those who survived these trials earned trust. This early structure made the gangs nearly untouchable. Law enforcement could investigate endlessly, but the walls of silence built on family loyalty blocked every attempt. Even witnesses often refused to cooperate, either out of fear or respect. The gang's rise was subtle, almost invisible. Neighbors saw young men gathering in streets or abandoned warehouses, but assumed it was harmless. Authorities considered them small-time criminals, easily dismissed. This underestimation became one of the gang's greatest advantages. While the world ignored them, they were building a foundation stronger than anyone expected. They learned which areas were vulnerable, which routes could be exploited, and how to move goods and people without attracting attention. Knowledge of the terrain became a weapon. Mountain paths, empty coastal villages, and disused ports turned into secret highways for contraband. By the end of the decade, these once small groups had evolved. They were no longer merely surviving, they were thriving in the shadows. Each action, each risk, each lesson learned had brought them closer to becoming a structured force with ambition far beyond Albania's borders. The quiet streets that once reflected despair now hosted a generation that understood how to turn chaos into opportunity. The story of the Albanian gangs did not start with violence or notoriety. It started with survival, cunning, and patience. Their journey was only beginning, and Europe had yet to notice the storm that was forming quietly in its southeastern corner. The Albanian gang's strength was not built on fear alone. It was rooted in bonds deeper than money or violence. From the earliest days, family ties and clan loyalty shaped the structure of these groups. Membership was not a matter of choice. It was inherited, earned, or tested through trials that demanded absolute obedience. Within these circles, trust was sacred and betrayal was unforgivable. A single misstep could lead to permanent disappearance. The clans were not just networks. They were living systems with hierarchies, codes, and rituals that reinforced loyalty at every level. Every member understood that their survival depended not on guns or threats alone, but on the loyalty of those around them. These early gangs were organized with careful precision. Leadership was not granted based on bravado or violence, but on experience, intelligence, and the ability to command respect. Older members, often seasoned in the harsh realities of life under Albania's turbulent transition, taught the younger ones not only to fight, but to strategize. They learned how to spot weaknesses, how to exploit opportunity, and how to disappear when danger loomed. Decisions were deliberate, calculated, and rarely impulsive. This discipline separated them from other criminal groups, which relied on chaos and intimidation. The Albanian gangs built power quietly, the way shadows stretch across a room, gradually unnoticed, but inevitable. The clan's internal rules were strict, yet invisible to outsiders. Violence was reserved for those who broke the code, often in ways that sent unmistakable warnings to others. Murders were precise and public, only enough to instill fear among potential traitors. Ordinary civilians were rarely harmed. This careful use of violence created a reputation that preceded the gangs themselves, a silent understanding across cities and borders. Betrayal or interference came at a terrible cost. Law enforcement agencies struggled to infiltrate the groups. Witnesses disappeared, evidence vanished, and investigations stalled. Officers could rarely trace crimes back to a single hand because the clans operated as cohesive units. The concept of the individual was subordinate to the loyalty of the group, making detection and prosecution nearly impossible. The Albanian gangs also understood the importance of secrecy. Communications were layered with codes. Messages were relayed through trusted intermediaries, and new members were often tested under extreme pressure before fully integrated. Even within the group, knowledge was distributed carefully. Leaders never revealed their entire network to any one person, ensuring that the capture or betrayal of a single member could not dismantle the organization. This careful structuring allowed the gangs to grow in size without sacrificing control. Every new member was both an asset and a potential risk, and the leadership treated them accordingly. Europe's authorities underestimated the power of these networks. They saw small-time criminals, petty thefts, and local violence, and assumed the gangs were fragmented and unthreatening. This assumption proved fatal in the years to come. The bonds that the clans had formed were more powerful than any law or police force. While outsiders believed the gangs were vulnerable to attack or infiltration, the clans quietly reinforced their structures, expanded their reach, and cemented their reputation. Their strength did not come from brute force alone, but from a disciplined system of loyalty, fear, and precision. By the time Europe fully realized their presence, these Albanian gangs were already operating as sophisticated organizations, united by blood and bound by a code that could not be broken. The foundation of fear and respect they built in these early years would allow them to dominate the continent's criminal underworld for decades to come. As the Albanian gangs grew stronger in the shadows of their own country, they began to look beyond Albania's borders. Europe's bustling cities, with their thriving ports and lucrative black markets, became irresistible targets. But these gangs did not rely on obvious channels like airports or major harbors. They had learned early that visibility meant vulnerability. Instead, they turned to forgotten roads, mountain paths, and abandoned border crossings routes that had been used by smugglers during wartime and quietly abandoned after decades of political turmoil. These hidden pathways became lifelines for the flow of contraband, and the gangs controlled them with meticulous care. The earliest operations were modest, small shipments of goods, sometimes stolen electronics, occasionally smuggled cigarettes or alcohol. These small ventures taught the gangs essential lessons about timing, observation, and trust. Every successful shipment built confidence and credibility. Each failure, though rare, reinforced the need for secrecy and discipline. By the mid-1990s, these lessons translated into larger ambitions. The gangs began collaborating with international criminal networks, importing narcotics from South America and trafficking them into Europe at unprecedented speed. Heroin, cocaine, and other controlled substances moved through the Balkans with a precision that stunned authorities. Each route was mapped in layers, with contingencies for inspections, rival gangs, and sudden police raids. Money from these operations was not squandered. Profits were reinvested in infrastructure, safe houses, new vehicles, communication tools, and bribes. Warehouses in Italy, Greece, and Belgium became hubs for sorting and redistribution, all connected by secret channels known only to the leadership. By creating a decentralized yet tightly controlled system, the gangs reduced the risk of exposure. If one node of the network was compromised, others continued to operate without interruption. The combination of redundancy and secrecy made their operations nearly untouchable. Communication was another critical advantage. The gangs developed methods to transmit information without leaving a trace. Couriers, coded messages, and clandestine meetings ensured that no outsider could easily intercept plans. Even within the network, knowledge was compartmentalized. Few members knew the entirety of a route or the full extent of operations. Leaders orchestrated the system with near-military precision, ensuring that each move was calculated, each shipment timed perfectly. Mistakes were rare, and when they occurred, they were dealt with decisively. Rival gangs, often larger and more established in Western Europe, underestimated these newcomers. The Albania's approach was methodical rather than aggressive. They did not seek open confrontation. Instead, they outmaneuvered competitors quietly, securing contracts and partnerships while avoiding unnecessary attention. Local criminal networks initially dismissed them as opportunists, but within a few years, the Albanian groups had become indispensable middlemen in multiple European drug routes. Their efficiency, discretion, and ruthlessness earned them a reputation that spread faster than any advertisement. By the late 1990s, what had started as small, hidden operations had transformed into an international network with reach across Europe. Authorities were beginning to notice the sudden influx of drugs, but tracking the Albanian gangs was nearly impossible. Their knowledge of geography, combined with discipline and secrecy, allowed them to operate under the radar. Each shipment that slipped through reinforced their confidence, and each border successfully crossed strengthened their reputation. The gangs had turned mountains, rivers, and abandoned highways into veins of a criminal empire. What Europe did not realize at the time was that these hidden routes were only the beginning, the foundation of a network that would soon dominate the continent's underworld with silent efficiency and deadly precision. By the time the Albanian gangs had established their smuggling networks across Europe, their approach to power had evolved. Violence was no longer their primary tool. It became a calculated instrument, wielded only when necessary. Unlike other criminal organizations that relied on chaotic displays of brutality, these gangs used fear with precision. Every act of violence carried a message, a warning designed to protect their reputation and control rivals without attracting unnecessary attention. Murders were executed swiftly and decisively, always targeting those who threatened the organization or betrayed its code. Ordinary civilians were rarely caught in the crossfire. This careful strategy allowed the gangs to build a reputation for ruthless efficiency while maintaining a level of invisibility that confounded law enforcement. The Albanian gangs understood that fear could be more powerful than bullets alone. Their reputation spread across European cities without the need for public showdowns. Rivals learned quickly that crossing these networks could be fatal, and even those who were only indirectly associated with the gangs felt the chilling consequences. Every execution, every disappearance, reinforced the notion that these groups were not chaotic street criminals, but disciplined and calculated operators. Their enemies did not simply die. They disappeared, leaving no evidence and no clues, a ghostly warning that the gang's reach extended far beyond what authorities could immediately grasp. With fear firmly established as a tool, The gangs turned to money laundering and legal enterprises to expand their influence. Nightclubs, construction firms, shipping companies, and import-export businesses became essential fronts. On the surface, these businesses appeared legitimate, providing services and jobs in communities across Europe. Behind the scenes, however, they were mechanisms to clean illegal proceeds from drug trafficking and smuggling. By integrating into the legal economy, the gangs gained both protection and legitimacy, making it difficult for authorities to distinguish between lawful business activity and criminal operations. They moved money seamlessly, blending it with legitimate earnings, while continuing to expand their network across borders. The careful balance between violence and business allowed the gangs to become sophisticated operators. They learned when to show strength and when to conceal it, ensuring that public perception always worked in their favor. Their influence extended beyond immediate criminal activity. In some cases, communities began to rely on these groups, whether for employment, protection, or local services. This created a strange paradox. The same organizations feared for their brutality were also seen as providers and enforcers of order in neighborhoods neglected by governance. The line between criminality and authority blurred, further complicating efforts to dismantle them. The gangs' calculated use of fear also extended to rival organizations. They did not seek open warfare with competitors. Instead, they used strategic strikes to destabilize opposition, remove key figures, and assert dominance quietly. They understood that sustained, unpredictable violence drew attention, while precise, selective action created a long-lasting reputation that commanded respect and obedience. Even as authorities scrambled to investigate growing reports of Albanian criminal activity, the gangs remained largely invisible, operating in plain sight while avoiding major exposure. By the turn of the century, the Albanian gangs had perfected the art of control. Violence was a measured tool, fear a currency, and legal enterprises the cover that allowed them to operate undetected. Their reputation spread across Europe, not through loud headlines or reckless crime, but through the quiet, calculated understanding that anyone who opposed them would pay the ultimate price. They were no longer street-level criminals. They were architects of an empire that used fear, influence, and cunning to dominate a continent's underworld. Their power was invisible, yet absolute, and their silent presence reshaped the landscape of European crime forever. As the Albanian gangs solidified their control over Europe's criminal underworld, their ambitions began to extend beyond smuggling and street-level operations. Wealth brought influence, and influence opened doors that even the most powerful law enforcement agencies could not easily access. Local governments and political figures across multiple countries began to experience subtle, unexplained decisions that favored certain businesses, investigations that inexplicably stalled, and policies that appeared to benefit unknown actors. The gangs did not seek headlines or public recognition. Their power was exercised quietly, in the shadows, where decisions were made without the public ever realizing who was pulling the strings. The gangs' approach to political influence was as disciplined and calculated as their criminal operations. Bribery was targeted, carefully calculated to ensure maximum impact with minimal exposure. Key officials were approached with promises of wealth, often through intermediaries, while others were threatened indirectly through methods designed to avoid traceable evidence. Families, businesses, and reputations became tools in a game of coercion, and the lessons of loyalty learned within the gang's own networks were applied externally to maintain compliance. These moves were subtle enough that politicians themselves often did not realize the full extent of the manipulation until it was too late. By the time authorities began noticing the patterns, the gangs had already embedded themselves deeply into the political and economic fabric of multiple cities. Their influence extended to law enforcement agencies as well. Investigations were slowed, evidence was misplaced, and leads vanished as if by magic. Officers who tried to pursue the gangs faced obstacles at every turn, often from within their own departments. Corruption was not random but methodical. The gangs identified the weakest links and exploited them, ensuring that their activities continued uninterrupted. This invisible network of control created a system in which the Albanian gangs could operate with near impunity. Even international agencies struggled to understand the depth and coordination of their influence. What appeared as inefficiency or coincidence was, in reality, the result of careful orchestration. The gangs also understood that overt control could be dangerous. Unlike traditional mafias that sought dominance through visibility, the Albanese preferred to shape outcomes quietly. By funding political campaigns, influencing key votes, and controlling access to resources, they ensured that the decisions they desired were implemented without ever needing to appear in public. Laws, zoning regulations, and business approvals were manipulated to their advantage. Even as Europe's governments publicly claimed to be cracking down on organized crime, the Albanian networks were quietly expanding their reach, often outpacing the very authorities tasked with stopping them. This combination of wealth, secrecy, and strategic influence allowed the gangs to move from local criminal enterprises to continental power players. They had learned that true strength lay not in violence alone, but in control over systems, networks, and decisions that affected entire populations. By shaping political and economic landscapes without ever revealing their hand, they became untouchable in ways that traditional law enforcement struggled to counter. The reach of their influence was so extensive that even cities far removed from Albania were indirectly shaped by their decisions, creating a silent empire that was invisible yet omnipresent. By the end of this stage, the Albanian gangs had transformed into more than just criminal organizations. They were shadow governments, operating in parallel to legitimate systems. Their mastery of influence, secrecy, and calculated manipulation ensured that power was maintained not through brute force, but through invisible control. Every law, every policy, every political move they influenced reinforced their dominance, creating a world where the greatest danger was not what was seen, but what remained hidden in the Balkan shadows. Their ability to operate unseen, yet shape outcomes across Europe, set a new standard for criminal power, one that authorities struggled to understand and that rivals feared to challenge. Success brought power, but power also brought internal tension. By the early 2000s, the Albanian gangs had grown into vast networks spanning multiple countries. Their influence reached politicians, law enforcement, and businesses alike. Wealth and control had created opportunities for the younger generation, who were ambitious and impatient. They wanted faster money, bigger operations, and more recognition. The older leadership, however, had learned the value of patience and discretion. They understood that visibility was dangerous and that mistakes could dismantle years of careful planning. This clash between generations created fractures within the gangs that would soon erupt into internal war. The conflicts began quietly. Disagreements over territory, drug routes, and leadership positions simmered beneath the surface. Young members, confident in their abilities and frustrated by the slow pace of decision-making, began acting independently. They took risks that older leaders considered reckless. Shipments were moved without permission, alliances with rival networks were attempted, and violent acts became more public. These actions threatened not only the gang's operations, but also their carefully cultivated reputation. In response, the older generation moved decisively, using the same methods that had built the organization: secrecy, strategy, and calculated violence. Executions and disappearances became the tools of internal discipline. Members who defied orders or endangered operations vanished without a trace. Sometimes entire crews were eliminated to prevent dissent or leaks. These purges were not chaotic. They were highly organized and carried out with precision, sending clear messages to anyone considering rebellion. Despite the violence, the gang's core structure remained intact because the leadership understood that survival depended on both fear and respect. Internal war, in this sense, was not destruction. It was a cleansing process that strengthened the organization by removing those who could compromise its stability. At the same time, these internal conflicts created a dangerous illusion for law enforcement. Authorities believed that the Albanian gangs were weakening, vulnerable to infiltration, or on the verge of collapse. This miscalculation allowed the gangs to regroup and reorganize without interference. The purges eliminated loose ends and centralized power among the most disciplined and loyal members. Young, ambitious recruits who survived the trials learned lessons in loyalty, patience, and discretion, ensuring that the next generation of leaders would be as ruthless and strategic as those who came before. These internal struggles also reshaped the gang's operational methods. Riskier routes were abandoned, and communication systems were upgraded to prevent leaks. Decision-making became more hierarchical and disciplined, with strict rules about who could execute which actions. Leadership, once more distributed among several trusted figures, was consolidated in a way that balanced the energy of youth with the caution of experience. The internal war, brutal as it was, ultimately strengthened the gang's resilience, preparing them for even larger challenges on the European stage. By the end of this period, the Albanian gangs had emerged from internal conflict stronger and more disciplined than ever. Ambition had been tempered by experience, and recklessness had been replaced by calculated risk. The organization that had once been a loosely connected network of clans had transformed into a highly structured empire, capable of surviving external pressures and internal betrayals alike. The lessons learned during this internal war would ensure that when the gangs expanded globally, they did so with precision, stealth, and an unmatched capacity for survival. The blood spilled in these years was not wasted. It was the foundation of an empire built to endure. After emerging from internal purges stronger and more disciplined, the Albanian gangs began to look beyond Europe's borders. Their operations had already stretched across the continent, but global opportunities promised even greater wealth and influence. By the mid-2000s, they were establishing connections with criminal organizations in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. These alliances were strategic, aimed at securing supply chains, expanding markets, and diversifying operations. The gangs were no longer content with being regional power players. They sought a presence in every corner where illicit trade could generate profit. The global expansion required a new level of sophistication. Albanian gangs invested heavily in technology, adopting encrypted communication systems to coordinate operations without detection. Digital currencies were used to move funds across borders, often through a complex web of shell companies and front businesses. Couriers and intermediaries ensured that physical shipments, drugs, weapons, and contraband could move undetected. Their organizational structure allowed them to operate as a decentralized network, with nodes in multiple countries functioning independently, yet following strict central guidelines. This made the network resilient. Even if law enforcement intercepted one operation, the rest of the system continued to function. The gang's global reach also allowed them to diversify their criminal portfolio. In addition to drug trafficking, they became involved in human smuggling, cybercrime, illegal gambling, and money laundering on an international scale. They identified weaknesses in law enforcement and regulatory systems worldwide and exploited them efficiently. Partnerships with Latin American cartels ensured a steady supply of narcotics, while Asian networks provided access to counterfeit goods and other illicit commodities. Each connection was carefully vetted, tested, and reinforced with mutual interest and fear, ensuring loyalty and reliability. Arrests and crackdowns became inevitable as law enforcement agencies caught glimpses of these operations. However, the gang's layered structure made them difficult to dismantle. Leaders remained insulated from frontline activities, often residing in safe locations with multiple identities. Mid-level operatives absorbed most of the exposure, taking the fall if necessary. For every member arrested, the organization replaced two more, each trained in the same discipline, secrecy, and loyalty that had defined the gangs from the beginning. This redundancy ensured that the network remained operational even under intense scrutiny. The Albanian gangs also learned to manipulate perception on a global scale. They avoided unnecessary violence in public, while strategically eliminating rivals and threats quietly. The combination of discretion, speed, and ruthlessness allowed them to expand without attracting the level of international attention that could threaten their operations. European authorities often believed that the problem was limited to specific countries, unaware of the transcontinental web of influence that had been quietly built. By operating globally, the gangs cemented themselves as a unique criminal empire. They were no longer defined by borders, nationality, or even traditional mafia structures. Their strength lay in invisibility, adaptability, and precision. While other criminal organizations relied on notoriety and reputation, the Albanian networks leveraged silence and control, ensuring that their influence was felt even where they remained unseen. By the end of this phase, it became clear that the Albanian gangs were a global force. Even after decades of growth, expansion, and consolidation, the Albanian gangs remained largely invisible. Their empire was not built on spectacle, but on careful planning, secrecy, and control. Across Europe and beyond, their influence was felt quietly, in unsolved crimes, mysterious disappearances, and the inexplicable success of businesses linked to them. Streets seemed ordinary, neighborhoods appeared peaceful, yet beneath the surface, an intricate web of control thrived. Authorities often knew only fragments, pieces of a larger puzzle that remained frustratingly out of reach. The gangs had mastered the art of moving silently, ensuring that power was exercised without drawing unnecessary attention. Their invisibility became their greatest weapon. By avoiding public displays of power, they prevented law enforcement from accurately assessing their reach. Investigations that seemed promising often collapsed because evidence was hidden or destroyed. Witnesses vanished or recanted, and even surveillance frequently failed to capture meaningful information. The Albanian gangs had perfected operational discipline to a point where even the most sophisticated agencies struggled to track them. This lack of visibility created fear that was magnified by imagination. Rival criminals, politicians, and law enforcement alike understood that the gangs existed and were powerful, but no one could predict where or how they would strike. This uncertainty became a form of control in itself. The gangs' ability to integrate into legitimate society further strengthened their influence. Businesses, legal enterprises, and investments provided both income and protection. They became difficult to distinguish from ordinary citizens, allowing them to operate openly while concealing illicit activity. Politicians and officials were subtly influenced, either through financial incentives or quiet threats. Policies were shaped, investigations stalled, and local authorities were sometimes unknowingly co-opted into the system. Power was exercised not through noise or spectacle, but through invisible channels, and those who attempted to challenge it quickly learned that opposition carried hidden dangers. Their reach extended beyond crime into social and economic structures. Entire neighborhoods, industries, and trade routes were touched by their presence. By controlling both legal and illegal systems, they created an ecosystem that reinforced their dominance. Rival gangs, even when ambitious, were carefully monitored and neutralized before they could become a real threat. This careful orchestration allowed the Albanian networks to remain stable over decades, growing quietly yet inexorably. Their ability to balance visibility with discretion, fear with loyalty, and legal operations with criminal activity ensure a long-term survival strategy that was virtually unmatched in modern organized crime. The most unsettling aspect of their power was its invisibility. Europe feared what it could not see. Reports of violence were inconsistent, investigations inconclusive, and arrests often only affected minor operatives. The leadership remained untouchable, and the organization continued to function seamlessly across borders. The gang's influence was not measured by headlines or arrests, but by the subtle control they exercised over economies, communities, and institutions. Their empire was a shadow, present in every city, yet never fully visible, a force felt more than understood. Even today, the Albanian gangs remain a specter over Europe. Their operations continue, and their influence endures, quietly shaping events and outcomes in ways most people will never see. The greatest twist of all is that their power is maintained precisely because it is hidden. Europe's authorities, rivals, and even the general public sense their presence, but no one can fully grasp its extent. The Balkan shadows are still moving, silent and untouchable, a reminder that the most dangerous power is often the one you never see coming. Their story is not just one of crime. It is a story of control, patience, and the terrifying efficiency of an empire built in the dark, where the shadow itself has become stronger than any light.